What if one of the most respected moral figures in American literature became famous not because he always told the truth, but because he understood something more dangerous than truth itself? That sounds almost wrong to say out loud. After all, we're taught from childhood that honesty is the foundation of justice. Tell the truth. Face the facts. Bring everything into the light. In courts, in schools, in public life, truth is treated as a sacred principle. The assumption feels so obvious that most of us never stop to question it. But what if that assumption is incomplete? What if there are moments when revealing everything does not create justice, but destroys it? And if that possibility makes you uncomfortable, that's exactly where this conversation begins. When people think about Atticus Finch, they often think about integrity. Not merely honesty as a habit, but integrity as a moral identity. He stands in the American imagination as something larger than a character. He functions almost like a symbol, a reminder that principles matter even when circumstances become difficult. But symbols have a strange habit. The longer we admire them, the less we examine them. And that raises an unsettling question. What if the real lesson hidden inside Atticus Finch is not about honesty at all? What if it is about judgment? Because there is a difference. Honesty follows a rule. Judgment asks what happens after the rule is followed. And those two things do not always point in the same direction. Imagine a courtroom built to reveal truth. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every procedure exists for one purpose: bring hidden things into the open. It is one of the most powerful ideas in a democratic society. But now imagine another reality. Human beings are not courtrooms. People carry wounds. Communities carry fears. Families carry secrets. Trust itself often depends on information being handled with wisdom rather than simply exposed. And suddenly the problem becomes much harder. Because the question is no longer, what is true? The question becomes, what should be done with the truth? That distinction changes everything. The deeper you look into great moral stories, the more you discover that justice is rarely a machine. It cannot simply take facts as input and produce fairness as output. Human life is messier than that. Sometimes values collide. Truth collides with mercy. Transparency collides with protection. Principle collides with consequence. And when those collisions happen, something remarkable occurs. The people we consider morally wise are often not the people who know the rules best. They are the people who understand the cost of applying them. That may be the hidden contradiction at the center of Atticus Finch. Not a man choosing between truth and lies, but a man standing at the uncomfortable intersection between truth and responsibility. A place where every decision carries a price. A place where revealing something can heal one person and harm another. A place where silence itself becomes morally ambiguous. And perhaps that is why this question still matters far beyond the pages of a novel. Because modern societies face the same dilemma every day. In families. In friendships. In institutions. In public life. We celebrate transparency. We demand honesty. We insist that truth sets people free. But does it always? Or is there a deeper truth hiding underneath that belief, a truth so uncomfortable that even our most trusted moral heroes force us to confront it? Because if justice sometimes requires more than honesty, then the real mystery is no longer about what is true. The real mystery is who gets to decide what truth requires. If truth is not always enough, then what exactly was Atticus Finch protecting? That question becomes even more difficult when we stop thinking about morality as a set of rules and start thinking about it as a system of responsibilities. Because responsibility changes the shape of every decision. A rule asks, what is the correct action? Responsibility asks, who will live with the consequences? And those are not the same question. One of the reasons Atticus continues to resonate across generations is that he occupies a role larger than that of a lawyer, a father, or even a moral example. He functions as an interpreter, a translator between principles and human reality. His influence comes not from certainty, but from judgment. And judgment is dangerous. People trust rules because rules feel predictable. They reduce complexity. They create the comforting illusion that every difficult situation has a correct answer waiting to be discovered. But what if some dilemmas do not have correct answers? What if they only have competing costs? That possibility reveals a deeper layer of the conflict. Most discussions about ethics focus on wrongdoing. We ask whether someone violated a principle, whether they crossed a line, whether they acted honestly. Yet the hardest moral decisions often emerge when every available choice contains both virtue and harm. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Truth can reveal injustice. Truth can also expose vulnerability. Truth can hold power accountable. Truth can also place fragile people under burdens they never asked to carry. The same principle that liberates can also wound. And that creates a problem many ethical systems struggle to address. Not whether truth matters, but whether truth alone is sufficient. Think about the image of an open door. Most people assume an open door is a symbol of freedom, transparency, access to what was hidden. But sometimes an open door reveals a wound rather than a solution. Sometimes knowledge arrives before wisdom. Sometimes information arrives before understanding. And when that happens, revelation itself can become a source of damage. That is why some of the most important decisions in human history have never been about discovering facts. They have been about determining what should be done after the facts become known. Notice how quickly the scale expands. What begins as an individual moral choice becomes a question for entire societies. How much transparency should institutions practice? How much privacy should individuals retain? How much truth can communities absorb before trust begins to fracture instead of strengthen? These are not literary questions anymore. They are modern questions. Questions that affect courtrooms, schools, families, governments, and every relationship built on trust. And hidden beneath all of them is the same unsettling paradox. People often assume that trust is built by telling the truth. But trust also depends on judgment. A person who reveals everything without wisdom may be truthful. Yet they may not be trustworthy. That distinction is uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply rooted cultural belief. We like simple moral equations. Truth equals good. Secrecy equals bad. Transparency equals justice. Reality rarely cooperates with equations. The deeper mystery is that human beings seem to understand this intuitively. We already know that context matters. We already know that timing matters. We already know that responsibility matters. Yet we continue searching for universal rules because uncertainty makes us uneasy. Perhaps that is the hidden burden carried by figures like Atticus Finch. Not the burden of choosing between right and wrong, but the burden of choosing between goods that cannot fully coexist. Between truth and protection. Between fairness and mercy. Between principle and consequence. And if that is the real conflict, then an even larger question begins to emerge from the shadows. What happens when two moral values are both right, and saving one requires sacrificing the other? What happens when two moral truths are both undeniable, and still completely incompatible? This is where the argument stops being philosophical and starts becoming dangerous. Because at this stage, we are no longer talking about whether honesty is important. We are talking about what happens when honesty collides with another value that is just as valid, just as human, and just as necessary for survival. Protection. And suddenly, the moral landscape stops being symmetrical. You are no longer choosing between truth and lies. You are choosing between two forms of harm. One that comes from silence. One that comes from exposure. And neither option is clean. This is the crisis point embedded inside every interpretation of moral authority. A figure like Atticus Finch does not exist to provide answers. He exists to expose the limits of answers themselves. And that is where the contradiction begins to tighten. Because the more absolute your commitment to truth becomes, the less room you leave for context. But the more you prioritize context, the more you risk compromising the very idea of truth. It is a closed loop. And there is no exit that does not cost something. Memory fragment, a courtroom where every statement is technically correct, yet the outcome still feels morally incomplete. That image captures the core tension. Facts do not automatically produce fairness. Information does not guarantee understanding. And transparency, in isolation, does not guarantee justice. So what begins as a simple moral principle starts to fracture under pressure. And here is where escalation enters. If truth alone is insufficient at the individual level, then institutions built entirely on transparency begin to reveal structural weakness. Systems designed to expose everything begin to struggle with situations where exposure itself becomes a form of harm. This is no longer about one decision. It becomes a design problem for civilization. Scale shift. From personal ethics to social architecture. From individual responsibility to collective consequence. And at this level, Atticus Finch stops being a character and becomes a symbol of a much larger question: how societies decide what kinds of truth are safe to release into the world, and what kinds of truth require restraint. But restraint introduces its own contradiction. Because once truth is filtered, someone must decide the filter. And that decision is never neutral. Memory fragment, a single revealed truth that changes how an entire community sees itself, but also fractures the fragile trust that held it together. That is the hidden cost that most moral frameworks do not fully account for. Not just whether truth is spoken, but what collapses after it is spoken. And here is the escalation that follows naturally from that realization. If truth can both liberate and destabilize, then morality cannot be reduced to disclosure alone. It must include timing, responsibility, and interpretation. But once interpretation enters the system, certainty begins to dissolve. And when certainty dissolves, authority becomes questionable. Who decides when truth is appropriate? Who evaluates the cost of silence? Who carries the burden of consequences that cannot be undone once information is released? These are not abstract questions anymore. They are operational. And the most unsettling part is that every possible answer creates a new vulnerability. If individuals decide, outcomes become inconsistent. If institutions decide, power concentrates. If rules decide, context disappears. And somewhere inside this triangle, the original ideal of pure justice begins to look less like a destination and more like an impossible balance that constantly shifts under human pressure. Memory fragment, the moment of silence in a room where everyone knows the truth, but no one agrees on whether it should be spoken. That silence is not emptiness. It is tension. And that tension reveals something deeper than any single moral choice. It suggests that truth may not be the final layer of justice. It may only be one of its components. Which leads to a destabilizing realization. If truth is not absolute in practice, then what is? And if nothing is absolute, then every act of moral clarity begins to carry a hidden uncertainty underneath it. Because even the decision to remain silent is itself a form of statement. And once that is understood, the boundary between honesty and responsibility begins to blur in a way that cannot be easily restored. Which raises a deeper and more unsettling mystery. If every moral choice involves loss, then is justice defined by what we preserve, or by what we are willing to sacrifice? What if the moment we try to preserve justice, we begin to quietly reshape what justice even means? Because at this point, something fundamental has already shifted beneath everything we have explored. We are no longer asking whether truth should be spoken. We are asking why truth was never the only thing shaping moral reality in the first place. And that is where the revelation begins to surface. Justice, in its deepest form, has never been a single principle. It has always been a negotiation between competing human needs that cannot fully coexist at the same time. And Atticus Finch, rather than being a symbol of pure honesty, becomes something more unsettling. A symbol of ethical prioritization. A mind that does not simply ask, what is true, but instead constantly recalibrates another question beneath it: what outcome preserves the most fragile form of humanity in this moment? That distinction changes everything. Because it suggests that moral clarity is not about eliminating ambiguity. It is about surviving within it. Memory fragment, a silent decision made without announcement, where the most important truth is not spoken, yet its absence protects something that cannot be restored once broken. This is where the deeper insight emerges. What appears as silence is not absence of truth. It is the management of consequence. And consequence is where morality becomes real. Not in theory, but in irreversible outcomes. When viewed through this lens, Atticus is no longer operating as a guardian of truth. He is operating as a guardian of collapsed thresholds. Points at which a single piece of information could destabilize trust beyond repair. And this reveals a hidden structure beneath the entire narrative. A system where morality is not measured by what is revealed, but by what is prevented from breaking. That is the revelation most people miss. Truth is visible. But stability is invisible. Truth can be spoken in a moment. But stability is built across time, relationships, and trust networks that cannot be reconstructed once destroyed. Memory fragment, a community holding on to shared understanding not because everything is known, but because enough is left unsaid to keep the structure intact. This reframes the entire ethical conflict. Because now the tension is not between truth and lies. It is between immediate clarity and long-term coherence. And those two goals often diverge under pressure. Scale shift. What begins as a personal moral dilemma expands into a structural principle that governs how societies function. Courts, families, institutions, and even friendships all rely on a hidden layer of selective disclosure. Not because deception is valued, but because total transparency can overwhelm the systems designed to hold human relationships together. And here is where the consequence becomes unavoidable. If moral actors are required to constantly manage what others can, emotionally and socially sustain, then ethics is no longer just about intention or honesty. It becomes about capacity. The capacity of individuals to absorb truth. The capacity of systems to withstand disruption. The capacity of trust itself to remain intact under pressure. And once capacity becomes part of the equation, morality can no longer be treated as absolute. It becomes situational architecture. A living system rather than a fixed rule. This is the deeper legacy embedded within the figure of Atticus Finch. Not perfection. Not purity. But judgment under constraint. A constant balancing act between revealing and protecting, between clarity and continuity, between truth as fact and truth as impact. And that is where the final layer begins to emerge. Because if morality depends on what people can withstand, then truth is not just something discovered. It is something timed. Something calibrated. Something shaped by forces that exist outside of logic alone. Memory fragment, a single sentence left unspoken at the exact moment it would have changed everything, not because it was false, but because it was too early to survive its own truth. And now the question that rises from this realization is no longer simple. It is not whether truth should be told. It is whether truth, when removed from timing and consequence, is even complete at all. Which leads to a deeper fracture in everything we thought we understood. If truth is incomplete without context, then what we call truth may already be only one version of something far more unstable. What if the deepest truth hidden beneath moral judgment is not about what should be said, but about what reality itself demands to remain intact? Because at this point, everything converges into a single unresolved pressure. Not the pressure of honesty. Not the pressure of justice. But the pressure of coherence. A world where every truth is spoken without restraint does not automatically become more just. It becomes more exposed. And exposure, without structure, does not create understanding. It creates fragmentation. And that is where the core revelation finally becomes visible. Moral authority, as embodied by Atticus Finch, is not rooted in the purity of truth. It is rooted in the management of moral consequences that truth alone cannot predict. He is not a figure who simply decides what is right. He is a figure who constantly negotiates what reality can survive. Memory fragment, a moment where silence is not avoidance, but an act of preservation, where what is left unspoken carries more ethical weight than what is spoken aloud. This reframes everything. Because truth, in its raw form, is not the end goal of justice. It is only the beginning material. Justice, at its deepest layer, is the process of deciding how truth enters the world, and what shape it must take in order not to destroy the very fabric it is meant to serve. And once that realization settles, the entire architecture of morality shifts. Atticus Finch becomes less of a symbol of absolute honesty and more of a symbol of controlled ethical exposure. A mind operating within constraints that no rule can fully define. A decision-maker who understands that every truth carries secondary effects that ripple far beyond its immediate meaning. Not all truths are equal in impact. Not all truths arrive at the right time. And not all truths are survivable in every context. Memory fragment, an invisible boundary drawn not by law, but by human capacity, where knowledge is delayed not because it is false, but because it is too heavy to exist without breaking something essential. This is the insight that changes the scale of everything. Morality is not only about alignment with principle. It is about timing, proportion, and psychological endurance. It is about whether a system, whether a person, a family, or a society, can integrate what is revealed without collapsing under its weight. And that means ethical responsibility cannot be separated from emotional consequence. What feels like truth is not always what functions as truth within lived human systems. And this is where the scale shift becomes unavoidable. From individual decisions to collective survival structures. From isolated honesty to shared stability. From moral clarity to systemic resilience. Societies do not fail only when they are deceived. They fail when they are overwhelmed by truths they are not prepared to process. And that creates a difficult paradox at the center of all judgment. The more absolute the commitment to transparency, the more fragile the system becomes under emotional and social strain. Yet the more controlled the truth becomes, the more power shifts toward those who decide what is revealed. Neither direction is neutral. Both carry irreversible consequences. And Atticus Finch, in this interpretation, stands precisely at that fault line. Not as someone who resolves it, but as someone who embodies the constant tension of maintaining it. Memory fragment, a decision that cannot be reversed once spoken, where the difference between justice and collapse is measured not in facts, but in what those facts do to everything around them. And now the philosophical weight emerges fully. If justice depends not only on truth but on survivability, then morality is no longer a fixed law waiting to be followed. It is a continuous act of calibration. A living negotiation between what is real and what can endure reality. Which leads to a final destabilizing question. If truth must always be shaped by consequence in order to remain just, then is justice something we discover, or something we continuously construct under pressure we can never fully control? What remains after truth has been carefully shaped, filtered, and timed is not clarity, but consequence that continues long after the decision is made. Because once morality becomes a system of calibration, something irreversible happens beneath it. Every choice stops being an isolated act. It becomes a chain reaction. And Atticus Finch, at this deeper level, is no longer a figure inside a story. He becomes a reference point for how moral systems survive their own complexity. The consequence of this way of thinking is subtle at first. It does not announce itself as failure or success. It appears as stability, as order, as a situation when nothing collapses immediately. But stability has a hidden cost. It requires continuous management of what is allowed to surface. And that management does not disappear after the moment of decision. It lingers. It becomes legacy. Memory fragment, A. Quiet understanding passed between people who never fully articulate the truth, yet continue functioning as if they all agree on what remains unsaid. This is the first layer of consequence. Not disruption, but adaptation. People adjust not to what is known, but to what is collectively withheld. And over time, this shapes behavior more than any explicit rule ever could. But adaptation is not neutral. It changes perception itself. When individuals learn that truth is not simply revealed but regulated by context, they begin to interpret honesty differently. Not as an absolute virtue, but as a variable force dependent on circumstance. And once that shift occurs, something larger begins to form. A cultural memory of selective truth. A legacy where morality is no longer anchored in certainty, but in interpretation under pressure. This is the silent inheritance of ethical ambiguity. Not confusion, but sophistication that carries emotional weight. Because the system does not become simpler over time. It becomes more aware of its own limits. Scale shift. From individual moral reasoning to collective psychological conditioning. From a single decision to a pattern that repeats across generations. From one figure acting under constraint to a society learning how constraint itself becomes a form of moral intelligence. And that is where the true consequence emerges. The more a system depends on calibrated truth, the more it trains its participants to evaluate not only what is said, but what is intentionally left unsaid. This creates a second layer of perception inside human interaction. A silent literacy of omission. Memory fragment, a conversation where meaning is carried not by spoken words, but by what both sides understand will never be spoken. This legacy is powerful, but it is also fragile. Because once people become aware that truth is managed, trust begins to shift its foundation. It no longer rests solely on honesty. It rests on judgment. On the belief that those who withhold information are doing so for reasons that preserve something larger than immediate clarity. And that belief cannot be proven. It can only be sustained. Which makes it vulnerable. And yet, paradoxically, it is also what allows complex societies to function at all. Because full transparency, without interpretive structure, produces overload. Not understanding. So what remains is a permanent tension inside every moral system that values both truth and human continuity. A tension that cannot be resolved. Only managed. Atticus Finch, in this light, becomes a legacy of controlled moral pressure. A reminder that ethical decisions do not disappear once made. They propagate. They influence how future decisions are imagined, justified, and emotionally processed. And that propagation does not remain confined to law or justice. It extends into relationships. Into institutions. Into the way people define responsibility itself. Because once you accept that truth must sometimes be shaped by consequence, you also accept that morality is not a fixed structure waiting to be obeyed. It is an ongoing negotiation between what can be known, what can be handled, and what must remain temporarily unspoken for systems of trust to survive. Memory fragment, the lingering presence of an unspoken truth that continues to influence behavior long after its absence is forgotten. And this is where the deepest consequence becomes visible. The story does not end with a decision. It ends with a pattern. A pattern that outlives the decision itself. A way of thinking that continues to operate even when the original context is gone. Which leads to a final, unresolved reflection. If every generation inherits not only truths, but also the rules for when truth should be limited, then who is the true author of justice, the one who speaks truth, or the one who teaches when silence becomes necessary? What remains when all moral systems have been pushed to their edge is not certainty, and not resolution, but a quieter and more uncomfortable recognition that human beings were never solving ethics like a problem to be completed, but living inside it as a condition that never stops evolving. And in that space, Atticus Finch is no longer a figure of answers. He becomes a figure of burden. Not the burden of knowing what is true, but the burden of deciding what truth becomes when it enters fragile human reality. That shift is the final inheritance of everything we have traced. Because once truth is no longer absolute in its impact, every act of honesty becomes a form of responsibility that extends far beyond the moment it is spoken. And responsibility does not end. It accumulates. Memory fragment, a moment of stillness after a decision is made, where nothing appears to change on the surface, yet everything in human perception has already been subtly reorganized around what was withheld and what was revealed. This is the final insight that remains after all the layers collapse into one another. Moral life is not defined by purity of truth, but by the endurance of relationships under the weight of truth. Not what is correct, but what can survive being known. And that is why the legacy of this story continues to matter. Because it does not offer a moral formula. It exposes the absence of one. It reveals that even the most respected ethical figures operate inside a space where clarity must constantly negotiate with consequence, and where silence is not always the opposite of honesty, but sometimes part of its structure. Memory fragment, an unspoken understanding between people who continue to trust each other not because everything has been revealed, but because they believe the choice of what remains hidden was made with care rather than neglect. This is the fragile architecture underneath human trust. And once you see it, you cannot fully return to the idea that morality is simple. Because every society, every relationship, every institution, eventually encounters the same invisible threshold. How much truth strengthens connection? And how much truth fractures it? And no system escapes this tension, because no human being is built to process reality without limits. That is the final weight of Atticus Finch as a moral reference point. He is not a solution to the tension between truth and mercy. He is evidence that the tension cannot be removed without destroying something essential in the process. And perhaps that is why this narrative persists far beyond its setting, far beyond its characters, and far beyond its historical context. Because it is not really about one courtroom, or one decision, or one moment of moral choice. It is about the structure of understanding itself. The way human beings learn to live with truths they cannot fully absorb all at once. The way societies depend on interpretation as much as information. The way silence and speech both become instruments of meaning rather than opposites of each other. Memory fragment, a final image of balance that never fully stabilizes, where truth and protection remain in constant motion, never fully aligned, never fully separated, always negotiating their place inside human judgment. And in that unresolved motion lies the enduring meaning of it all. Not that justice has an answer. But that justice is what happens when human beings continue choosing, again and again, how much reality they are able to carry without breaking the connections that hold them together. And so the final question is not about Atticus Finch at all. It is about us. If every act of truth inevitably reshapes the world around it, then what does it truly mean to live honestly in a reality where honesty itself can never be separated from its consequences?